Hello everyone, Mr. Lichty here, and I'm looking to continue our notes on Japan, which were first started yesterday. This will be part 2. Make sure that you are filling out your study guide as we go. It will be submitted over either paper copy in Classroom or over Google Classroom. For the most part, I didn't address it in the first video. It will be, for as long as it's complete, and you guys have made an honest attempt to fill it out, I will give you full credit for it. I just want to make sure that you guys do understand the material I'm giving you, and, ultimately it's going to be the notes you use for any test I give in the future, so I just want to make sure you guys are filling that out. But now, that's besides the point. I want to continue back with where we left off, and that was Japan doing awfully well, given the circumstances of World War I, They really, enjoyed all the benefits of all these other countries fighting and being able to do really whatever they wanted at the moment. And I asked you guys exactly, what do you think is going to happen? And I'm here to tell you. If you look at this little graph right here, starting around the beginning of World War I, at this little valley right here, Japan was kind of stagnant after their, recent successes in China and Russia. They kind of started going back down, but once the war took off, you can see they started importing a lot of goods and outporting it. They were becoming active members of the trade going around the world. And with that, the Japanese people were enjoying a much better lifestyle. And you know what? They decided that they kind of wanted to see some more changes. And the changes they were looking to implement during the 1920s were more of a democratic nature. They wanted to see more things that the United States enjoyed. They wanted to be able to vote more. They had an emperor all this time, and they realized that, what? You can end up being more involved in your government. You can have a say. The government isn't there to, make sure that the government does better. The government's there for the people. And we start seeing during the 1920s a lot more reforms coming in. With that, of course, with democracy, you're inevitably going to get political parties. They begin to rise in Japan. They start growing. We start seeing a kind of party that's more dedicated to going more towards democracy. And we start seeing some parties that don't really want new things. They want to keep it as it is. But the important thing is, as those parties grew, we see a new building being constructed. This building is called the Diet. Now, that's not very important in of itself. I just want you guys to know that the Diet to Japan is kind of like what the U.S. Congress is to, the United States. This is where things are going down, and this is the central part of the entire Japanese government at this point. They are starting to grow, and people are starting to listen to it. Now, more sort to the democratic reforms, we start seeing new things introduced. By 1925, all adult men, regardless of their wealth, could end up voting. And I know that doesn't seem very nice all by itself. It's just a very small group of people. But I want you guys to keep in mind, when the United States first formed, only rich, white, landowning people could vote. And over time, we start seeing it get progressively and progressively better. That's the case here for Japan, too. This is not a significant step, but it's still the first step. It's definitely a step in what I would call the right direction. And on top of that, Japan is looking to, get kind of closer with, the United States, the British, the French, and they don't really want to tread on their toes. So what they decided to do is, after the war is over, they stop their aggressive, expansion into Asia. They decide that, maybe the United States will listen to us a lot better and be more willing to work with us if we just kind of settle down a little bit. Now, despite all of these good things that are seemingly happening, a new form of government where people can get engaged in, it wasn't all, sunshine and rainbows, There was a kind of a darker side to what was going on in Japan during this time. With all these great things came, well, not so great things. After World War I ended, during World War I, they were trading aggressively. They were selling to the United States, they were selling to the French. But when the war was over, a lot of those countries really didn't need to buy as many supplies. And so we begin seeing that the Japanese exports are very steadily going down. And on top of that, we start seeing that it's really, I call them the peasants. It's really the lower class people that are not having a good time right now. Many of them were forced off their farms and had to begin working in factories. And once they got into these factories, you may remember that during the Industrial Revolution, you didn't really want to be a factory worker. You weren't making a lot of money. It just was not good conditions to live in. And these factory workers were the ones that were really suffering the most during this Japanese decline in the 1920s. And with that, a lot of these people end up becoming a lot more attracted to the ideas of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. They want to go more towards the communist way. They like the idea that, they get to have a say and they get to, share in the wealth of everything going on. And we start seeing, groups of Japanese people really becoming big advocates for this way of thinking. And on top of that, it's worth pointing out that there's also another group that is formed in Japan at this point. It's a very wealthy group that we can call the Zaibatsu. And the best way to describe the Zaibatsu is that they're kind of the old-timey people, They like the old Japan. They don't really want to see anything new. They want to stay true to this warrior lifestyle. They want to go back to the way of the samurai. They don't want these new democratic reforms. They are just trying to keep it as it was. And in the PowerPoint here, I refer to them as Japanese conservatives. I want to make sure you guys know, when I say conservative, I don't mean Republican. And usually if I say liberal, I don't mean Democrat. What I mean by conservative is they just want to go back to the way it was, or they want to keep things the same. That's the way I'm going to use that word from now on, just so you guys know. Now, with all of these other events happening in Japan, a not-so-good thing also ends up happening. In 1923, Japan ended up seeing one of the biggest earthquakes that we have, ever recorded. There was a big one in San Francisco back in the day that we talk about. This one makes it look like, just a quick shake of the bassinet, Here we see entire cities crumbling, and it especially hit Tokyo. Imagine just 650 buildings, not 650, 650,000 buildings collapsing down and just seeing rubble for miles and miles. That's what Tokyo looked like at this point, and many other parts of Japan. And with that, we see 100,000 also dead. And on top, and not so importantly, but still a factor, half of the survivors, the people that managed to survive this earthquake and tried to carry on, they were out of their jobs because of destroyed buildings. And I do want to say, despite this major event that ended up crumbling Japan, Tokyo and many other cities and different areas managed to actually recover pretty slowly, but still very efficiently. And just as things started to look better, we start getting to a not so good event happening again. You guys might remember the Great Depression. Now, when the Great Depression hits, the United States is hit the hardest. And when the United States is hit, well, keep in mind, when the United States exited World War I, they were the center of all of the economies, Britain, France, Germany, every major country was somehow tied to the United States. And when the United States went under, all of these other countries came along with it. The whole world ended up entering the Great Depression when the United States did. And when that happened, the countries that Japan was selling all of their goods to, they couldn't really afford to buy Japanese goods anymore. And when that happened, all of the factory workers that were already having problems, either from, just the transition in their industrialization, or from, the earthquake that they had recently suffered, unemployment got hit again. And we see, massive amounts of unemployment across all of Japan. And on top of the factory workers suffering, what farmers they had left were also just unable to provide for themselves. And they were just starving across the land. Now, when this happens, we see a lot of things happening in Japan. And we had a lot of Japanese people wondering why exactly this was happening to them. They were looking for a reason. And we had some individuals that would end up capitalizing on that. Going back to those Zaibatsu, those old-timey people that wanted to take Japan back to, its great roots, they ended up doing something called, or bringing a lot of ultra-nationalist takes. Now, if you guys don't remember exactly from the World War I unit, nationalism, or the way I like to consider nationalism, is patriotism on steroids. Now, ultra-nationalism, imagine even more steroids. Ultra-nationalism is crazy, insane nationalism. And these people in Japan really wanted the people to, feel love for Japan, Japan before everything else. And these same wealthy people really wanted to expand the Japanese Empire again. Japan, before World War I, is going deep into Asia. They were conquering all of China. They were conquering a lot of, all of the coastal cities there. And they wanted to get back to that. And one of the ways they kind of encouraged the average Japanese citizen to do that was they were looking at how other nations were treating Japanese people. Specifically in America, Japanese people in America did not have a good time, They were often looked down. They were seen as, people stealing American jobs. And they were just generally not liked throughout the entire United States, specifically in the West Coast where most of them were, where we see California today. And I guess California then as well. And they promised, if we can get more land, if we can get more land in China, Korea, and all these other places, we'll have room to build more factories. And when it comes to that, they were already kind of set in not actually invading any more countries. They wanted to, not aggravate the West. So to get around that, these, old-timey people, the ones that wanted to go back, they really had a pretty interesting idea. And it would eventually be referred to as the Manchurian Incident. And it's a bit wacky, to say the least. So what Japan decided to do was they had built some railroads in China while they were there, and they decided that they were going to end up bombing their own railroad tracks in 1931. Now, you might be wondering, why would you blow up your own railroad tracks? Well, have you ever had one of those situations where you were arguing with a sibling, or maybe you saw someone arguing with a sibling? And, I know I did it with my brother. I'd be, yelling at him, and midway through the argument, he might actually just kind of start, hitting himself, ow, ow, Mr. Lichty's hitting me. That's what, Japan was going for. When this happened, and they blew up their own railroad tracks, they ended up saying that it was the Chinese that did it, and that Japan needed to act in self-defense. So Japan kind of made up this fake reason to be able to start invading again into China. And the really funny thing is, the Japanese military, ended up doing this without telling anyone else about it. The Emperor of Japan, and even the new Japanese Diet, they had no clue that this was even happening. They did it all on their own. And later we're going to learn more about what the League of Nations is. But to say the least, it was condemned worldwide. And the Japanese citizens didn't really care that the government did do it. They liked the idea of Japan further going into Asia and building more industry. So they ended up siding with the military. And at this rate, we start seeing the military and people that are heavy in the military, they start becoming the ones in charge. The people really, really liked them. And, the average Japanese citizen loved what they were doing as they were conquering land, and beginning to be able to stand toe-to-toe with the West. The actual governments, the ones that were supposed to be in charge, couldn't really do anything. Think about it this way. Imagine if, the United States, a new law was passed banning, pizza across the United States. Imagine if every citizen in the United States just said, no, I like pizza, and every industry just kept making pizza. Would the government be able to do anything? Especially if the military liked pizza too? No. So the actual government ended up having to listen to the military and ended up kind of losing control of them. And what this happened, they ended up suppressing a whole bunch of groups across Japan. Those communists that were kind of forming, they ended up getting persecuted and kind of, rounded up and put in certain areas. People talking about socialism and all of these other democratic things, being able to vote. That had to stop. You weren't allowed to talk about that stuff anymore. And they continued to put into the people's minds this idea that they need to go back to the way it was. We need to go back to our warrior heritage, is what they kept saying the whole time. And around that, they kind of ended up finding a guy, the Emperor Hirohito is his name. They ended up saying that Hirohito was the guy that was sent by God to end up ruling the Japanese Empire, and that everyone should listen to them. The funny thing with that is, Emperor Hirohito didn't really have much power because he was forced to listen to the military. He was kind of a little puppet for them, in a way. Now, things are going to kind of get even more interesting as we go about this with Japan, but I kind of want to bring us to a close for now. Some other notes I want you to take into account right now is that towards 1936, Japan started finding other allies, other nations that wanted to go back to the way it was. And two of the really big ones that will come up a lot more later are Italy and Germany. In 1937, they would start pushing farther into China, and just actually start invading much of it. A full-scale invasion almost. And the plan for the Japanese army at that point was that they just wanted to capture it in a few years. But something ended up coming up in Europe that would end up getting in the way, and we'll talk about that instance later. But for now, I want you guys to just kind of wrap up your notes and kind of ponder, what exactly is happening in Japan and where we might see stuff like this happening down the road. Again, fill out the notes, and yeah, I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Peace.